Welcome to today's deep dive. Usually when we study a historical event or like a physical place, we approach it with this distinctly modern mindset.
Right,
We
absolutely.
want the information to be clean and categorized, measurable.
Yeah.
We treat history almost like we're reading a medical x-ray, looking for the solid, undeniable structures beneath the surface.
Yeah, that's exactly how we do it today.
But today, we are tossing that modern x-ray machine right out the window. We've got this massive stack of sources, including translated historical scrolls, incredibly detailed archaeological surveys from mountain shrines, and deep analyses of medieval Japanese paintings.
Some really fascinating stuff in there, yeah.
And we're using them to help you completely unlearn everything you think you know about one of the most famous landmarks on Earth, which is Mount Fuji.
Yeah, and to truly understand the history we're about to explore, we really have to strip away our entire contemporary definition of what a mountain even is.
Right.
Because today, we view mountains as geographic features. We see a peak, we calculate its elevation, map a trail, and then we just climb it for recreation.
Like it's a physical challenge to conquer.
Exactly. The modern baseline for interacting with a mountain is pure conquest. You get your high-tech gear, you check the weather on your phone, you reach the top, take a selfie, and you go home.
Which is funny because hundreds of thousands of tourists hike Mount Fuji in a single summer today. So it's incredibly easy to project that exact recreational mindset backward through time.
Oh, for sure. It's almost automatic for us.
But our mission for this deep dive is to trace a radical, almost unbelievable transformation. We're going to look at how Mount Fuji went from being this terrifying, untouchable geological monster that people were too scared to even approach
Yeah, literally terrified.
to becoming the ultimate destination for an intense, exclusive, and highly dangerous religious practice.
Right. And the historical texts we're examining, they point to an era where the act of climbing was known as tuhai, which roughly translates to ascent as worship.
Ascent as worship.
Yeah. For the medieval ascetics who pioneered this practice, the summit wasn't just, a pile of rocks to be bagged. They viewed it as a literal, physical portal to another realm.
A portal.
Right, the domain of gods and Buddhas.
So if the modern mindset is all about physical recreation, this medieval mindset we were diving into is about existential survival
Oh, right.
and spiritual rebirth.
Exactly.
But to understand how anyone could look at a massive volcano and decide to walk up it for spiritual reasons, we actually have to start by looking at a time when doing so was considered an absolute death sentence.
Yeah, you had to stay far away.
Right, so we need to go back to the 9th century. And based on the historical records from that time, people were not looking at Mount Fuji as this beautiful postcard image. They were looking at an active, raging inferno.
The geological reality of the 9th century is just so critical here. Mount Fuji was in a period of violent, highly active volcanism. I mean, we're talking about massive, landscape-altering eruptions.
Not just a little smoke.
No. The historical documents record the Enryaku eruption around the year 800, and then that was followed by the catastrophic Jogan eruption in 864.
Just massive events.
To put the Jogan eruption into perspective, the sheer volume of lava spewed from the mountain was so immense that it flowed down the slopes, completely filled up massive ancient lakes at the base,
Wow.
and created the sprawling, dense woodland we now know as the Aokigahara Forest, or the Sea of Trees.
That is insane. For anyone listening who has ever lived near an active fault line or, a severe weather zone, imagine that level of anxiety.
Right.
But multiply it by a factor of 10.
Right, it's a totally different scale.
If you are a farmer or a villager living anywhere in the vicinity of this mountain in the 800s, you aren't marveling at the scenery. The mountain is a constant looming existential threat.
It's terrifying.
It's something that can rain fire on your home and literally bury your entire world in ash and molten rock overnight.
And because of that very real physical danger, the religious approach to the mountain was strictly dictated by distance. The practice was known as yuhai, which means worshipping from afar.
Worshipping from afar.
Yeah, the thought of setting foot on the slopes was unfathomable. Instead, the people living in the region built specific structures known as senjin shrines at the foot of the mountain, intentionally keeping a very safe distance from the peak.
And the purpose of these shrines wasn't to celebrate the mountain's beauty,
Yeah.
right? It was basically an act of desperate diplomacy.
Yeah, absolutely. The entire function of the early Sengen shrines was appeasement. The people believed the mountain was the physical manifestation or the domain of a powerful deity known as Asama Okami.
Okay, Asama Okami.
Right. And the volcanic eruptions were interpreted as the wrath of this deity. So the rituals conducted at these distant shrines were essentially pleas.
Just begging.
Exactly. The villagers were begging Asama Okami to remain calm, to, spare their crops from ash, and to withhold the lava flows.
It makes me think of how we might treat a highly active, smoking nuclear reactor today.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
You respect it, you fear it, you build containment zones around it, and you absolutely do not just pack a lunch and go for a casual stroll into the core. It commands respect through sheer terror.
Yeah, and that level of geothermal violence created this impenetrable psychological barrier. The mountain was perceived as an alien, otherworldly domain.
Just completely separate from us.
Right. It was considered the realm of immortals, gods, and spirits, fundamentally separate from the fragile world of human beings. To cross that boundary was not just physically dangerous, it was a profound spiritual transgression.
The sources include a specific text that captures this terror incredibly well. It is a late 9th century document called the Fuji-san, or the Record of Mount Fuji.
Right, by Miyako no Yoshika.
Yes, written by a scholar from the Heian period named Miyako no Yoshika. And the way he describes the mountain is nothing like a modern geological survey.
Not at all.
He describes the massive crater at the summit as a boiling cauldron. The specific Japanese word he uses is kushiki, which was a traditional steamer used for cooking rice.
And the sensory details Miyako no Yoshika includes in that text, they're meant to convey a profound sense of awe and hostility. He writes that the crater emits this pure blue steam.
Blue steam, wow.
Yeah, and he claims that if a person were somehow able to look down into the bottom of that crater, it would look exactly like violently boiling water. He also notes the terrain itself, describing slopes covered in treacherous white sand.
And the text makes it very clear that the mountain actively rejects any human presence, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Miyako no Yoshika writes that if anyone even attempted to climb it, they could only reach what he calls the belly, like the middle elevation of the mountain.
Right.
After that, they would be turned back by a combination of freezing snow, loose sand that causes you to slide backward with every step, and the unbearable heat emanating from the rock itself.
And beyond those physical obstacles, he also documents the deep-seated belief that the upper reaches of the mountain were inhabited by divine beings.
Oh, yeah. Like the immortals.
Right. There are broader cultural legends from this era, such as the famous tale of the bamboo cutter, where an emperor chooses to burn an elixir of immortality at the peak of Mount Fuji, specifically because it is the closest geographical point to heaven.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. The constant smoke rising from the crater during this highly active period was seen as a visual tether to the divine. It was a connection you just dared not approach.
So for hundreds of years, the mountain is essentially this giant, terrifying keep out sign written in fire. The theology of the time dictates that you stay far away and just pray the volcano doesn't destroy your life.
Exactly.
But human nature is driven by this intense curiosity. If you tell an entire civilization that a specific place is a forbidden, untouchable zone of death, eventually somebody's going to look at that fiery cauldron and decide they need to cross the boundary.
And that shift from worshiping at a safe distance to actively seeking the summit, it requires a massive ideological leap. It takes a very specific, deeply driven kind of individual to be the first to attempt it.
Right.
And we find that individual in the historical records of the 12th century, a legendary ascetic named Matsudaira Shunin.
So to understand what made Matsudaira even attempt this, we have to look at what changed between the 9th century and the 12th century.
Yeah.
The mountain itself started to behave differently, right?
Exactly. By the 1100s, the violent, landscape-altering volcanic activity that characterized the 9th century had finally subsided.
It calmed down a bit.
Yeah, Mount Fuji was still an active volcano. It was still smoking, and the environment was still incredibly harsh. But the immediate daily threat of massive lava flows had lessened.
Right, so you weren't dodging rivers of fire quite as often.
Exactly. And this slight quiet in the geological record opened a window. It allowed religious figures to start viewing the mountain not just as a monster to be appeased, but as the ultimate testing ground for spiritual endurance.
And according to a historical text called the Honshu Seiki, which was an official chronicle recorded around the year 1149, Matsudaira didn't just test the waters. The text claims this man climbed Mount Fuji hundreds of times.
Hundreds of times. The records attribute monumental achievements to Matsudaira. He is credited with essentially domesticating the hostile summit from a spiritual perspective.
Domesticating it.
Yeah. According to the text, he built a temple right up there at the edge of the crater, dedicating it to Dainichi Nyorai, the supreme cosmic Buddha. He is also said to have buried sacred Buddhist sutras at the summit to create a physical and spiritual link between the human world and the divine.
Okay, this is where reading the historical sources requires a healthy dose of modern skepticism, I think.
Fair enough.
Because if you picture the reality of the 12th century, a monk wearing basic hemp robes and straw sandals, attempting to climb a 3,776-meter volcano with no marked trails, no supplemental oxygen, and no way to predict sudden alpine storms, the idea that he did it hundreds of times and just casually built a temple at the top sounds like pure myth.
It does, yeah.
It sounds like hagiography. A story exaggerated by later followers to make their founder look like a superhuman deity.
Well, the historical community shared that exact skepticism for a very long time. It's so easy to assume that Matsudaira perhaps climbed a portion of the way up, and the hundreds of times to the summit was just religious propaganda.
Right.
But the sources we are looking at today include hard archaeological data that completely upends that skepticism.
Wait, really?
Yeah, we don't just have ancient manuscripts claiming he went up there. We actually have physical artifacts pulled from the dirt at the summit.
Wait, walk me through what they actually found in the crater.
So, archaeologists conducting excavations at the highest points of Mount Fuji uncovered physical evidence of these medieval ascetic practices. Specifically, they found bronze sutra cylinders buried in the freezing, rocky volcanic soil.
Bronze cylinders.
Yeah. A sutra cylinder is a metal tube designed to encase and protect sacred Buddhist texts from the elements. And the dating on these artifacts is remarkable. They trace back to the late 12th and early 13th centuries, clustering around the Jukyu era, which spans from 1219 to 1222.
Oh, wow. So even if the claim of climbing it hundreds of times was a bit of historical inflation, the physical proof is undeniable.
Absolutely.
Matsudaira, or at the very least, his immediate and incredibly dedicated followers, were absolutely reaching the summit.
Yeah.
They were surviving the altitude, the sheer cold, and the treacherous scree specifically to bury these bronze tubes.
They were really up there.
But help me understand the logic here. Why go through the agony of climbing a deadly volcano just to bury a scroll in the dirt?
The motivation is tied to a powerful Buddhist concept prevalent at the time, known as Mappo, or the latter day of the law. Right. During the 11th and 12th centuries, Japan was experiencing significant social upheaval and natural disasters. And this led to a widespread theological belief that the world had entered a dark age, where the original teachings of the Buddha were inevitably going to be lost or corrupted by human failings.
So it was essentially an apocalyptic mindset. They thought the spiritual world was decaying.
Yes, exactly. And as a countermeasure to this decay, devout ascetics believed they needed to preserve the sacred texts for a future time. They would painstakingly copy sutras and then seek out the most inaccessible, pure, and sacred locations they could find to bury them.
Like a time capsule.
Exactly like a time capsule. The goal was to safeguard these teachings until the arrival of Miroku, the Buddha of the future, who would come to restore enlightenment to the world. By choosing the summit of Mount Fuji to bury these bronze cylinders, Matsudaira was turning the highest, most dangerous point in the country into a cosmic vault.
That completely reframes the entire act of climbing. He wasn't doing it for the thrill. He was trying to save the spiritual future of humanity by utilizing the mountain's extreme inaccessibility as a vault.
Exactly.
And in doing so, he shattered that psychological barrier we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
The mountain wasn't just an untouchable monster anymore. It had become an active altar.
Yeah, Matsudaira proved that the physical threshold could be crossed. But, there is an enormous difference between one visionary ascetic pulling off an extreme feat of endurance and the establishment of a lasting religious movement.
Right, you need more than just one guy.
For this practice of Tuhai to survive beyond Matsudaira's lifetime, it required infrastructure. It had to evolve from an isolated act of extreme devotion into a highly organized, systemic practice.
Which moves our focus to the southern foothills of Mount Fuji and the rise of a religious tradition called Shugendu. Because even in the medieval period, you don't just wake up one morning and decide to casually walk up a volcano.
No, absolutely not.
You need training. You need a staging ground.
Right. And the staging ground that emerged was the Murayama Sengen Shrine and its associated temple complex, Murayama-kuchi. The archaeological reports detailing this area are fascinating because they reveal how intentional the geography was.
How so?
Well, the village of Murayama was established on the southern slope of the mountain at an elevation of approximately 500 meters.
And that specific elevation is not a coincidence. It serves as a literal and figurative dividing line.
It is the absolute geographical threshold. If you look at the terrain, everything below the 500-meter mark of Murayama represents the human world. It's where you find agricultural villages, normal daily life, and the safety of civilization.
Right.
But the moment you step above Murayama, the environment changes drastically. You enter the deep, disorienting sea of trees, the incredibly steep volcanic inclines, and eventually the harsh, lifeless alpine zone. Murayama sits perfectly on the border between the known world and the terrifying unknown.
It is an ideological border crossing. For anyone listening who has ever tackled a massive, life-altering project, whether it's preparing for an extreme physical event or even stepping into a highly intensive academic or professional program, you need a space to transition.
Oh, for sure.
You need a place where you leave your normal life behind and prepare yourself mentally and physically for the ordeal ahead. Murayama functioned as the ultimate spiritual base camp.
Exactly. And the people gathering at this base camp were practitioners of Shugendu.
Shugendu.
Yes. To understand what they were preparing for, we need to understand the mechanics of this belief system. Shugendu is a highly syncretic Japanese religious tradition. It took the indigenous Shinto practices, which involve the worship of local nature deities, or kami, and fused them seamlessly with the complex rituals of esoteric Buddhism that had been imported from the continent.
Wow, so a real blending of ideas.
Yeah, and then it layered both of those systems over an ancient, pre-existing tradition of shamanistic mountain asceticism.
So they weren't just praying to a Shinto mountain god, and they weren't just sitting in a temple meditating on a Buddhist concept. They were actively merging those theologies through extreme physical exertion in nature.
Exactly. The practitioners of this tradition are called yamabushi, a word that literally translates to those who lie in the mountains.
Those who lie in the mountain.
Yeah. Their core philosophy was that true spiritual power, which they called Jonriki, and ultimate enlightenment, could not be achieved through study alone. It had to be earned by stripping away every comfort of human civilization and subjecting the physical body to the harsh, unforgiving, and often violent realities of the natural world.
And the 2005 archaeological excavations at Murayama that are detailed in our sources, they really highlight how serious this training was. The archaeologists didn't just find the ruins of a quaint little shrine.
No.
They uncovered a massive engineered complex. They found terrace platforms carved into the hillside, heavy stone foundations, the remains of specific ascetic dwellings, and designated ritual purification areas. This was not a passive place of worship. It was an elite, rigorous training facility.
And the layers of history revealed in those excavations are vital. They uncovered pottery and artifacts dating back to the 12th century.
Which ties right back to our first guy.
Exactly. This aligns perfectly with the era of Matsuda Shinden, proving that the infrastructure at Murayama was developing in tandem with the very first successful ascents of the mountain. The entire site was architecturally designed to facilitate the terrifying transition from a regular human being into a hardened Yamabushi.
So we have this intense base camp, and we have these elite ascetics preparing to cross the 500-meter threshold. But what is the actual map they are following in their minds? Like when a Yamabushi leaves the safety of Murayama and starts walking up into the dense, dark forest, what do they believe they are walking into?
Well, they believed they were walking into a geographical projection of a spiritual journey. The medieval cosmological view of Mount Fuji was radically different from our modern understanding of geology.
Right.
To the ascetics, the mountain was a physical, three-dimensional mandala.
Let's explore how that actually works. Because when most people hear the word mandala, they picture the intricate, colorful sand paintings created by Tibetan monks, or the complex geometric patterns used in meditation. How does a massive, chaotic volcano function as a mandala?
That's a great question. In esoteric Buddhism, a mandala is essentially a visual map of the spiritual cosmos. It illustrates the complex relationships between various deities, different realms of existence, and the path to enlightenment.
Okay, so it's a map.
Yeah, and the genius of the Shugenyu practitioners was taking that flat, two-dimensional theological diagram and mapping it directly onto the brutal, three-dimensional topography of Mount Fuji.
So they looked at the slopes, the forest, and the crater, and they assigned specific spiritual meaning to the physical geography. The rocks weren't just rocks, they were stages of existence.
Exactly. And the most significant mapping occurred at the top. The summit of the volcano was no longer viewed simply as the highest geographical point. It was explicitly identified as the physical manifestation of the Pure Land, or the paradise, of Dainichi Nyorai.
Help us understand the significance of Dainichi Nyorai in this context.
So Dainichi Nyorai, also known as Mahavairokana, is the central, supreme cosmic Buddha in esoteric Buddhist traditions. He is not just a historical figure who achieved enlightenment. He is considered the ultimate source of all illumination and the literal embodiment of the universe itself.
Wow, the embodiment of the universe.
Right. All other deities and Buddhas are seen as emanations of him. Therefore, the logic dictates that physically reaching the summit of Mount Fuji meant you were literally stepping into the tangible presence of the supreme cosmic Buddha.
To help visualize this incredible concept, the sources point us toward a specific type of ancient artwork called the Fuji-san mandala. There are multiple surviving versions of these paintings, and they serve as visual records of this exact medieval worldview.
They're stunning to look at, too.
Yeah, and when looking at descriptions of these mandalas, they feel less like traditional art and more like ancient instruction manuals for achieving enlightenment.
Well, the functional purpose of these paintings was absolutely instructional. You have to remember that a significant portion of the population during this era was illiterate.
Right, you can't just hand them a book.
Exactly. You couldn't hand a prospective pilgrim a dense, multi-volume theological text to explain esoteric Buddhism. You needed a striking, comprehensive visual representation that showed them exactly what the journey of spiritual transformation looked like, step by painful step.
The composition of the Fuji-san mandala is really striking because the mountain is always divided into three very distinct vertical tiers. And walking through these three tiers perfectly illustrates what the experience of Tuhai was actually meant to be.
Right. The lowest tier of the painting represents the mundane, earthly realm. This is where you see depictions of the Moriyama shrine complex.
Down at the bottom.
Yeah. The artwork shows human figures, pilgrims arriving at the base camp, engaging in the initial purification rituals under waterfalls, and preparing for the ascent. It is a busy, human-centric zone. It represents the starting line of existence.
Then the painting transitions into the middle tier, and the entire mood of the artwork changes. It depicts a dark, rugged, incredibly steep path winding through dense, forbidding forests and jagged rocks. You see the pilgrims struggling physically.
It's very bleak.
Yeah, and the paintings often include wild animals, such as monkeys, which were viewed not just as wildlife, but as divine messengers of the mountain god.
Right, the messenger.
This middle section represents the realm of profound suffering and grueling ascetic trials. It is essentially a physical purgatory. It is the zone where you were meant to burn away your worldly attachments and human weaknesses through sheer physical agony.
And then finally, the artwork brings your eye to the top tier, representing the summit. The painting depicts the massive crater, but hovering directly above the three main peaks that surround the caldera are physical, glowing manifestations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas.
Hovering right there in the sky.
Yeah, they are bathed in golden light. This represents the ultimate goal of the Tuhai, the successful arrival in the Pure Land and the achievement of spiritual rebirth.
So the physical act of climbing the mountain was a literal reenactment of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. You leave your normal human life at the bottom, you suffer and metaphorically die to your worldly self in the brutal middle tier, and if you survive, you are reborn as an enlightened being at the top. It is a beautiful, profound theological structure.
It is profound in theory, but we must confront the reality of what this meant in practice. The artwork uses golden light and serene Buddhas to depict the summit, making the journey look majestic. But the physical reality of executing this climb in medieval Japan was brutally, unfathomably difficult.
Oh, absolutely.
We need to ground the theology in the dirt, the freezing cold, and the sheer physical exhaustion of the actual ascent.
Let's dive deep into that brutal reality of Tuhai. Because reading the historical accounts of what these ascetics had to endure just to prepare for the mountain is staggering. This was the furthest thing from a recreational hike. It was an elite, punishing practice that demanded absolute submission from the human body.
Oh, the extreme demands began long before a pilgrim was ever permitted to set foot on the actual mountain trail. The historical texts detail mandated strict periods of shujin kesai. This phrase roughly translates to intense purification and abstinence, and, it was non-negotiable.
What did that actual process look like for someone preparing at the base camp? Like, what were they doing?
Well, it required a complete overhaul of one's physical habits. It meant adhering to a highly restricted diet. The ascetics were forbidden from consuming any meat, and they also had to avoid pungent vegetables like garlic or onions.
Just a total reset.
Yeah. The belief was that these foods excited the human senses and tied the practitioner to their earthly desires. It also mandated complete abstinence from sexual relations. But perhaps the most physically taxing element of the preparation was the practice of massage.
The cold water ablutions. For anyone listening who complains about the discomfort of taking a cold shower when the water heater breaks, the reality of massage is hard to comprehend.
It's brutal. The pilgrims were required to aggressively cleanse their bodies and their spirits by standing directly beneath freezing mountain waterfalls for extended periods.
Boiling water.
Yes. Alternatively, they would immerse themselves in icy lakes or travel to the ocean. The sources specifically document pilgrims journeying to Taganora, a coastal area, to purify themselves in the freezing seawater before they even began the trek to Murayama.
Why was this extreme level of physical purification so necessary?
Because they believed the mountain itself was perfectly pure, and the deities residing there were highly sensitive to human defilement.
I see.
If a pilgrim dared to step onto the sacred slopes while still carrying the spiritual dirt of the human world, they believed the mountain would actively punish them.
And when you are dealing with a massive volcano, the concept of the mountain punishing you is not an abstract religious metaphor. It is a very real physical threat.
Oh, absolutely.
Sudden violent alpine storms, massive rockfalls, freezing nighttime temperatures. If a pilgrim died on the mountain, it wasn't viewed simply as bad luck or a hiking accident. It was interpreted as a moral and spiritual failure. It meant they weren't pure enough to be there.
And that intense fear of the mountain's judgment is precisely why no one was ever permitted to undertake the Chuhai alone. The historical sources place immense, almost total emphasis on the role of the sendatsu.
Let's talk about the sendatsu because the texts usually translate that word as a guide. But based on the descriptions of their duties, calling them a guide feels like calling a military drill instructor a fitness consultant.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah, it completely understates their power. Why was the sendatsu so absolutely critical to this process?
Well, a sendatsu was infinitely more than someone who just knew the trail. They were veteran spiritual masters. These were elite yamabushi who had survived the grueling ascetic trials of the mountain many times over. When a group of pilgrims left the safety of Murayama, they surrendered absolute, unquestioned authority to the sendatsu.
When you say absolute authority, you mean they held the power of life and death over the group.
Quite literally. The sendatsu dictated every single physical movement. They decided the pace of the ascent, when the group was allowed to rest, and when they were forced to push through exhaustion.
Wow.
But their physical leadership was actually secondary to their role as spiritual protectors. Remember the middle tier of the mandala, the dark path of suffering?
The purgatory zone.
Right. The ascetics genuinely believed that this zone was inhabited by angry spirits, territorial demons, and the restless, tortured souls of pilgrims who had failed and died on the mountain in the past.
The psychological weight of that must have been crushing. I mean, you were exhausted, freezing, climbing a steep incline in the dark, and you genuinely believe that invisible demons are actively trying to destroy you.
Yeah, and the sendatsu was the only person equipped to handle that spiritual threat. They possessed the esoteric knowledge required to protect the group. They knew the specific, complex chants, the precise mudras, which are powerful hand gestures, and the intricate rituals necessary to ward off these malevolent entities.
But they also had to manage the very real physical demons of the volcano. The sources highlight the terrifying reality of Ochudo.
Right, Uchido. That refers to sudden, deadly rockfalls. Mount Fuji is composed largely of loose volcanic ash, pumice, and jagged scree. The slopes are incredibly unstable.
Just loose rock everywhere.
Yes. A massive rock can dislodge from higher up the mountain and plummet downward silently and lethally. The sendatsu were the only ones who knew how to read the subtle changes in the weather, how to identify inherently unstable sections of terrain, and how to keep a group alive in sudden, blinding whiteout conditions.
So you had to listen to them.
To disobey a direct order from the sendatsu didn't just mean getting lost. It meant physical death from the environment, or utter spiritual ruin from the unseen forces.
There is a specific detail regarding the physical preparation that I think perfectly encapsulates the gravity of what these ascetics were doing. The sources note the very specific clothing they wore for the ascent.
Oh, yeah.
They were dressed entirely in white robes. Now, to a modern observer, you might see people in white robes at a Japanese summer festival and think it looks like a beautiful traditional outfit. But in the context of medieval Japan, the color white carries a very specific, dark meaning.
It is a vital detail. In medieval Japanese culture, white was the color of death. The white robes worn by the ascetics were literal burial shrouds.
Wait, so they were intentionally dressing themselves as corpses before they started the climb?
Exactly. By donning the white burial shroud at the Moriyama base camp, the pilgrim was making a profound physical acknowledgement. They were openly declaring that they were leaving the world of the living behind.
That's intense.
They were undertaking a brutal journey from which they fully understood they might not return physically. Furthermore, they were stating that they should not return spiritually unchanged. They viewed themselves as walking corpses, seeking resurrection at the pure land of the summit.
That reframes everything. It is the absolute defining essence of Tuhai. This was an exclusive, agonizingly physical, highly structured, and profoundly dangerous religious act.
Totally.
It stands in total stark contrast to the casual recreational climbing that begins to develop centuries later during the Edo period. And it is a universe away from what we see today, with the paved roads, the bullet trains, and the vending machines waiting at the summit.
If we step back and trace the entire historical arc we have discussed today, we were looking at a staggering evolution of human perception. We began in the 9th century, looking through the eyes of Miyako no Yoshika at a terrifying, volatile geological monster.
Right.
It was a boiling koshiki, observed safely from afar, demanding appeasement from terrified villagers.
Then, in the 12th century, the visionary ascetic Masudai Shenen breaks that ancient seal of fear, proving that the monster can actually be touched, and burying sutras to save the future.
Following that breakthrough, the Yamabushi at Murayama institutionalized the act. They engineer a spiritual border crossing, transforming the chaotic volcanic rock into a highly regulated ascetic trial, mapping a complex cosmic mandala onto the physical landscape.
And finally, the devout pilgrims, surrendering their autonomy to their sendatsu, walk that massive three-dimensional mandala in their own burial shrouds, enduring freezing waterfalls and deadly rockfalls, all to seek the pure land of Danichi Nyorai at the summit.
It's incredible.
It is a complete reimagining of what the physical world represents. They didn't actually change the mountain, they changed their minds about what the mountain was.
And that transformation, from an object of pure geological terror to an instrument of profound spiritual salvation, is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of human interaction with nature. It demonstrates that our understanding of geography is never just about dirt and rock. It is always deeply intertwined with our theology, our psychology, and our search for meaning.
Which brings us back to the modern baseline we started with. The Gore-Tex jackets, the GPS trail maps, the summit selfies. We look at nature as a resource to be managed, a beautiful backdrop to be photographed, or an obstacle to be conquered for sport. We have largely replaced the deep, terrifying mystery of the natural world with measurable metrics.
We have, and while there is immense value in safely enjoying a beautiful hike, I think the history of Tuhai offers a compelling alternative perspective. What if we attempted to view our highest peaks with the same awe and reverence that the medieval ascetics did?
What if we looked at them not as a physical challenge to be beaten or a backdrop for a social media post, but as an ancient living entity?
What if we approached the natural world with the understanding that it might demand our absolute spiritual submission in order for us to truly understand our fragile place in the universe? The next time you see an image of Mount Fuji, or really any great mountain, look past the aesthetic beauty and ask yourself, do you just see a landscape or do you see a sleeping god?
A physical portal waiting to be crossed. Until next time, keep diving deep.